Arkansas River Valley, Colorado. October 1881. The air had already turned sharp. A blade honed on the distant, snow-dusted peaks of the Sawatch Range. Cottonwoods along the river had surrendered their gold, leaving a stark architecture of gray branches against a piercing blue sky. It was a season for final preparations for chinking logs and stacking the last of the winter's cordwood for mending fences and banking root cellars with straw. It was not, in the considered opinion of every man in the valley, a time for playing in the mud. Yet that is precisely what Margaret Harlan was doing. Day after day, she worked at the base of her small, tidy log cabin, a structure identical to a dozen others scattered along the settlement road. She wasn't chinking, she wasn't stacking wood, she was digging. With a shovel and a wheelbarrow she had borrowed from the general store and never returned. She excavated the heavy ochre-colored clay from a pit 50 yards from her home, mixed it with water from the creek and handfuls of dry bunch grass pulled from the hillside, and began packing it with a strange methodical patience against the walls of her house. She moved slowly, deliberately, like a woman performing a ritual whose meaning was known only to her. The clay was thick as bread dough. It clung to her forearms, her apron, the edges of her boots. She didn't seem to mind. She tamped each load into place with the flat back of a shovel, building it up layer by slow layer, shaping something that had no name in any language the valley spoke. Tom Hadley was the first to stop and stare. He had been riding the rutted track that passed for a road heading downriver to check on a sick heifer when the sight of a woman elbow-deep in mud pulled him up short. He sat in his saddle for a long minute, his hat pushed back on his head, his mouth slightly open. Margaret, stripped to her work blouse, despite the chill, didn't seem to notice him. She hauled another barrel full of the thick plastic mud, dumped it at the base of the north wall, and began tamping it into place. Tom let out a short, incredulous laugh that echoed across the empty meadow. His voice carried easily in the thin mountain air, landing on Margaret's ears like a pebble tossed against glass. She didn't look up. By the end of the first week, the story had traveled to every cabin in the settlement. The widow Harlan was burying her house in mud. She was packing it against the walls like a woman trying to push the earth itself through the logs. Nobody could say why. Nobody had been brave enough to ask. Silas Barnett heard the story from Tom Hadley over a shared jug of cider at the general store. Silas was the valley's best carpenter, a man whose confidence was built as squarely as the barns he framed. He had hands like shovels and opinions that rested on the bedrock of proven method. He had built Margaret Harlan's cabin the previous autumn, and he had built it well. Tight-fitting saddle notches, a stone foundation laid plumb and true, walls of straight pine, each log selected for soundness and stripped of bark with a draught knife so sharp it sang. By the standards of the frontier, it was a fine home, one of his best. The idea that someone, a woman, a widow with 2 small children, was slathering his work in river mud sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. He drove his wagon out to her place the next morning, telling himself it was curiosity, not indignation, that moved him. He pulled up on the track and sat for a moment, his hands resting on his knees, his jaw working slowly on a plug of tobacco. What he saw was worse than he had imagined. The mud pile had grown into a formidable slope reaching 1/3 of the way up the log walls on the north side. It wasn't a wall, it was a rampart. A crude sloped buttress of packed earth that transformed the sharp-cornered cabin into something organic and strange, a dwelling that seemed to be growing out of the ground rather than resting upon it. The clean lines of his joinery, the precise notches he had cut with a pride bordering on vanity, were disappearing under a tide of ochre clay. Margaret was on her knees near the northeast corner, pressing a double handful of the clay mixture into a gap between the earth and the lowest log. Her 2 children, a girl of 9 and a boy of 6, were carrying small buckets of water from the creek to the mixing pit, their faces serious and focused. The girl, Lena, had her mother's dark blonde hair and the same steady, unremarkable patience in her movements. The boy, Peter, was smaller, quieter, his coat too large for his body, his eyes following his mother's hands with the concentration of a student watching a master. Silas swung down from the wagon. The sound of his boots hitting the frozen ground made Margaret look up. Her face was streaked with clay, her hands caked to the wrists. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between wariness and calm appraisal. The look of a woman accustomed to being watched and judged. His voice came out harder than he intended, the words propelled by a professional affront he couldn't quite swallow. "Mrs. Harlan, what in God's name are you doing to that cabin?" Margaret stood wiping her hands on her apron. She was not a tall woman. Standing before the massive Carpenter, she looked almost fragile, except for her forearms, which were roped with the kind of lean muscle that comes not from occasional labor, but from a lifetime of it. She looked at him the way she might look at a storm cloud on the horizon, something to be acknowledged and assessed, but not feared. "I am making it warm?" The simplicity of the answer stopped Silas for a moment. He looked at the wall of mud, at the children with their water buckets, at the mixing pit, where the clay sat in a heavy, glistening mound. He shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head when he sees a neighbor building a fence in the wrong place and knows the conversation that must follow. Tom Hadley, who had ridden up behind Silas out of pure curiosity, let his horse step closer. He leaned forward in his saddle, a grin spreading across his windburned face. "Making it warm by burying it. Looks like you're trying to turn the place into a badger den, Mrs. Harlan." Margaret said nothing. She turned back to her work, pressing another handful of clay into the wall with the flat of her palm. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. She had stated her purpose. The earth would prove or disprove it. Words were not her currency. Silas stood for another minute watching her work. There was something in the precision of her movements, the way she tamped the clay in even courses, that pricked at his professional attention. She wasn't slapping mud at a wall. She was building something. But he couldn't see what, and his pride wouldn't let him ask again. He climbed back onto his wagon, clicked his tongue at his mules, and drove away without another word. Tom Hadley followed. And for the next mile, the two men discussed the widow Harlan's sanity in the frank, ungenerous terms that come easily to people who have never been desperate enough to try something no one else understands. The work continued for another week. By the end of the second, the mud pile had grown into something formidable, reaching halfway up the log walls on three sides. The north wall, which faced the prevailing winter wind, bore the thickest coat, nearly 6 feet at the base, tapering upward in a smooth, compacted slope. The east and west walls carried less, perhaps 4 feet at the base. The south wall and the two small windows that faced the low winter sun remained untouched. The cabin's original shape was almost gone, swallowed into a low, rounded form that looked less like a house and more like a burial mound or a kiln half sunk into the hillside. The clean geometry of Silas Barnett's carpentry had vanished beneath a skin of earth. The men called it Harlan's Folly. Some more cruelly called it the Mud Hill. They said the widow had lost her mind, that the loneliness of the high plains had finally cracked her. A few of the women in the settlement were kinder, or at least more cautious in their judgment, because they had seen the dark circles under Margaret's eyes. The previous spring had seen the way her children clung to her skirts at the general store, and understood that a woman alone with 2 small children in a country that killed strong men without apology was entitled to her own kind of logic, even if it looked like madness from the outside. But what did this woman, this Missouri-born daughter of kiln builders, a person who had spent her life not with timber frames, but with fire brick and vaulted clay domes, understand about the relentless physics of heat loss that the seasoned carpenters and homesteaders of the valley, for all their practical experience, had missed entirely? The answer to that question would not be found in argument or debate. It would be written across the landscape in ice and frost during the deadliest winter the valley had seen in a generation. It would be a lesson delivered not in words, but in the silent, irrefutable language of survival. Margaret Harlan had never felled a tree with the intention of building a house from it. She had never held a broadaxe or shaped a tenon. She came from a different world of making one that worked not with the grain of wood, but with the plasticity of earth. In the rolling country south of the Missouri River, her family had been builders for 3 generations, but not builders of houses. They built kilns, they built ovens. Her grandfather, a man named Ezekiel Polk, had built his first brick kiln in 1819 from river clay and fieldstone firing bricks for the farms and churches that were spreading across the young state. He taught the trade to his daughter Agnes Margit's mother because she was the only one of his children who had the patience for it, the willingness to wait for clay to dry at its own pace to read the color of a flame and know its temperature by instinct. Agnes Polk was one of a handful of women in Missouri who could build a bread oven from scratch. She could take raw clay from a riverbank, mix it with sand and chop straw, and raise a vaulted dome that would hold an even baking heat for 10 hours on a single firing. It was not a skill she talked about in company. The men who hired her husband to build brick kilns did not always know that the slim, quiet woman who mixed the mortar had designed the firebox. But Margit knew. Margit had grown up with her hands in clay, feeling its weight and texture change as it dried, learning to read its cracks the way a sailor reads the surface of the sea. She understood fire not as a brute force for warmth, but as a manageable energy, a current to be stored and directed. Her mother's bread oven was the proof. 2 hours of fire, 10 hours of heat. The clay remembered. She married William Harlan in 1871. A farmer with steady hands and a quiet disposition, a man who never once mocked her knowledge of clay and kilns, who understood without being told that his wife saw the world through a different lens than most. They had 2 children, Lena in 1872 and Peter in 1875. And for several years they lived on a small farm near the Gasconade River, where Margit helped her mother build ovens for neighboring farms, and William raised hogs and corn with a competence that never quite translated into prosperity. The decision to go west came in the spring of 1880, driven not by desperation, but by a restless practical ambition. Land in Colorado was cheap. The soil was thin, but the sky was enormous, and there was a future in cattle and hay that Missouri's crowded river bottoms could no longer promise. They sold the farm, loaded their belongings into a wagon, and joined a small party of emigrants heading toward the Arkansas River Valley. William drove. Margit sat beside him, holding Peter on her lap, Lena riding in the back among the flour barrels and bedrolls. They were a family moving towards something, not away from it. The mood was light, even hopeful. The hope died in Kansas. William Harlan fell sick on a Tuesday afternoon 12 miles west of Dodge City. The fever came on fast, a wall of heat that turned his skin the color of tallow and put a tremor in his hands that wouldn't stop. By Wednesday night, he couldn't sit upright. By Thursday, he was delirious, calling out for his father, who had been dead for 15 years. Margit drove the wagon with one hand and held a wet cloth to her husband's forehead, with the other, her eyes fixed on the flat, indifferent horizon. The nearest doctor was 2 days behind them. The nearest town was a day ahead. She chose forward. William Harlan died on a Friday morning, just as the sun cleared the eastern edge of the plains. He was 34 years old. Margit buried him beside the trail, marking the spot with a cairn of limestone rocks she pulled from a dry creek bed. She let Lena place the last stone. Peter was too young to understand what was happening, but he stood very still, his small hand gripping the hem of his mother's skirt, and he did not cry. Neither did Margit. She stood over the cairn for a long time, her face empty of expression, and then she turned, climbed back onto the wagon, picked up the reins, and drove west. There was nothing behind her now. The only direction that made sense was the one William had chosen. She arrived in the Arkansas River Valley in September of 1880, a widow with 2 children, a wagon full of tools and provisions, and $62 in gold coin sewn into the lining of her coat. She bought a small plot on the north side of the river from a land agent in Buena Vista. A transaction completed in 15 minutes with no small talk. The plot came with a newly built cabin, one of several that Silas Barnett had constructed on speculation that autumn banking on the steady trickle of settlers coming up the valley. It was a solid little house. 4 walls of straight pine, a stone hearth, a plank door that hung true. By the standards of the frontier, it was a good home. Margit moved in with her children on the first day of October 1880. She stacked her provisions, arranged her kitchen, hung a quilt over the single window to cut the draft, and sat down at the table with a cup of chicory coffee to contemplate the winter that was coming. She had never spent a winter above 7,000 feet. She had never lived in a log cabin. She did not know what the cold could do at this altitude in this thin, dry air, with the wind coming down off the Sawatch Range like a river of ice. She would learn. Their first winter was not a single catastrophe. It was a slow, grinding education in the physics of heat loss. The misery was chronic, accumulative, a thief that stole comfort and energy in small, relentless increments. Mornings were the worst. Margit would wake before dawn, her breath visible in the dark cabin, and find a thin film of ice on the water bucket, barely 10 feet from the stove. The cast-iron stove itself would be cold, its fire reduced to a bed of gray ash overnight. All its heat fled through the logs and the roof and into the black sky. She would rebuild the fire with numb fingers feeding it kindling, and then larger splits of pine waiting for the iron to warm for the first wave of heat to push back the cold. The cabin would warm grudgingly, the air near the stove becoming tolerable while the corners and the floor remained bitter. The stew she cooked rich and hot in its pot would cool to lukewarm within minutes of being ladled into bowls on the table, the heat wicked away by the cold air, and the cold wood and the cold tin of the bowls themselves. The drafts were the most insidious enemy. They weren't obvious gales blowing through gaps in the chinking. They were subtle, invisible rivers of cold air that flowed along the floor, like water pooling around ankles and feet, chilling the lower half of the body, no matter how close one huddled to the fire. Lena developed a cough in November that lingered through March, a dry hacking sound that punctuated the nights like a metronome. Peter learned to sleep in his coat, curled into a ball under every blanket. They owned his small body, conserving its heat with an instinct older than civilization. Margit burned through her woodpile at a pace that frightened her. The cast-iron stove glowed red-hot, consuming fuel with a ravenous, indiscriminate appetite. Yet the heat seemed to vanish into the walls and out through the roof, a fleeting presence that never truly settled into the bones of the house. She felt like a woman pouring water into a cracked jug, watching it seep away faster than she could fill it. She could not afford to keep burning wood at this rate. She could not afford to buy more. And she could not afford another winter like this one, watching her children shiver and cough, while her carefully hoarded resources drained away into the indifferent sky. Something had to change. Not the fire, not the wood, the house itself. She watched the cabin through the long cold months of January and February, studying it the way she would study a faulty oven in her mother's workshop. She pressed her palm against the interior log wall and felt the cold radiating inward, a constant, gentle pressure of frigidity that no amount of chinking could stop. The logs were not the problem in themselves. They were decent insulation, better than plank walls, better than canvas. But they were lightweight. They absorbed heat quickly and released it just as quickly to the frozen world outside. The cabin had no capacity to hold warmth, no reservoir, no memory. In her mother's bread oven, the walls were 18 inches of packed clay. 2 hours of fire heated the clay mass to a uniform temperature. And then the fire was swept out and the bread went in. The oven held its heat for 10 hours because the clay was dense and heavy and slow to change temperature. It absorbed energy during the firing and released it gradually, evenly over the long baking cycle. The clay remembered the fire long after the flames were gone. The cabin remembered nothing. Its walls were thin and light, a poor vessel for the precious heat she poured into it each day. The solution was not more fire. The solution was more memory, more mass, more earth. The idea took shape slowly through the remainder of that first winter, forming in her mind the way a plan forms in the mind of a builder, not as a sudden inspiration, but as a gradual accumulation of observations and principles. By the time the snow melted in April and the valley turned green with the first tentative growth of spring, Margit Harlan knew exactly what she was going to do. She was going to wrap her house in clay. She was going to give it the thermal mass it lacked, the dense, heavy, heat-holding body of an oven. She was going to turn a wooden box into a vessel that could store warmth the way her mother's bread oven stored the heat of a fire. She spent the summer preparing. She located the clay deposit, a thick vein of heavy ochre-colored alluvial clay, in the bank of a dry wash 50 yards from her cabin. She tested it, kneading it in her hands, checking its plasticity, its binding strength, the way it cracked when it dried. It was good clay, heavy with iron oxide, dense and cohesive. She cut bunch grass from the hillside and spread it to dry in the sun, knowing that the hollow stems would trap microscopic pockets of air within the clay matrix, adding a small but meaningful insulative value to the mass. She gathered river cobbles and flat stones enough to build a footing, a drainage layer at the base of each wall that would channel snowmelt and rain away from the logs. This was her mother's technique, the same method Agnes Polk used to keep the wooden frames of her kilns dry despite being encased in clay. Water runs down, stone channels it out, the wood stays dry, the clay breathes. But the confidence she carried in her hands did not always reach her mind. There were nights during that summer of preparation when Margaret sat alone at the table after the children were asleep, staring at the walls of the cabin, and felt the full weight of what she was about to attempt. She was one woman. She had no help. She had no precedent, no engineer's drawings, no guarantee that what worked for an 18-inch bread oven would work at the scale of an entire house. Her mother had built ovens, not fortifications. The leap from one to the other was enormous, and she was making it alone in a place where failure meant not embarrassment but danger. If the clay cracked in the cold, if the moisture seeped inward and rotted the logs as any carpenter would predict, if the sheer weight of 40 tons of earth buckled the walls or shifted the foundation, she would have destroyed her only shelter and have nothing to show for a season's labor, but a pile of mud and a house that was worse than before. She thought of William. He would have believed her. He would have helped without needing to understand, because he trusted her hands the way he trusted his own. But William was a cairn of stones beside a trail in Kansas, and trust was something she would have to manufacture for herself out of the same raw materials she had always used: knowledge, patience, work. She began the work in early October 1881 as the cottonwoods turned gold and the first hard frosts whitened the meadows at dawn. She dug the clay, mixed it with water, and chopped grass in a shallow pit, and began applying it to the walls in courses about a foot high, letting each layer dry just enough to bear the weight of the next. She worked methodically, starting at the base of the north wall and building outward and upward, creating a slope that leaned against the logs like a buttress, massive at the base, tapering as it rose. The stone footing went in first, a layer of cobbles and flat rocks that would keep the clay above the wet ground and provide a channel for water to escape. It was during this work, during the second week of October, that Silas Barnett made his second visit. He came alone this time, dismounting from his horse with the deliberate air of a man performing a difficult but necessary duty. The earthwork had grown substantially since his first visit. The north wall was now encased in a smooth, compacted slope of clay, nearly 4 feet thick at the base, reaching up past the midpoint of the logs. The east wall was underway. The cabin was beginning to lose its angular man-made shape, transforming into something rounded and organic, a form that belonged more to the landscape than to any carpenter's blueprint. Silas walked the perimeter slowly, his practiced eye noting the thickness, the slope, the way the clay had been applied in even horizontal courses. He stopped at the northeast corner, where the 2 walls of earth met in a smooth curve. He ran his hand along the surface. It was cool and firm, the texture of fired pottery. He had to admit privately, grudgingly, that the craftsmanship was impeccable. Whoever this woman was, she knew her medium. But knowing clay did not mean knowing wood, and that was the crux of his concern. He found Margaret at the mixing pit, kneeling in the mud, working a fresh batch of clay with her bare hands. She looked up at him, her face calm, expectant. She knew why he was here. She had been waiting for this conversation. His tone was serious, stripped of the casual condescension of his first visit. This was a professional warning delivered with the gravity of a man who believed he was trying to prevent a disaster. Mrs. Harlan, we need to talk about what you're doing here. I know you think this is helping, but I am telling you, as a carpenter, as a man who has worked with wood for 20 years, you are destroying your house. He laid out his case with the methodical precision of a closing argument. She was burying green pine logs in wet clay. The logs could not breathe. They could not shed moisture. Come spring, when the thaw came and the snow melt saturated the ground, the earth packed against the walls would become a sponge. The logs would draw that moisture inward. They would swell. They would sweat. And by May they would be rotten punk soft enough to push a thumb through. He had seen it happen. He had torn apart cabins ruined by exactly this kind of well-intentioned ignorance. He built things to stand for 30 years. He would not stand by and watch a house he built be buried alive. I'm trying to help you, Mrs. Harlan. This is a mud coffin. Margaret listened without interrupting. She stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the north wall. She laid her palm flat against the packed earth the way a doctor lays a hand on a patient's chest, feeling for the heartbeat beneath the skin. She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. My mother built bread ovens, clay domes 18 inches thick, built over wooden frames, oak frames. The wood held the dome up while the clay dried. After 30 years, when my mother broke down the old oven to build a new one, the oak inside was hard as iron, not a spot of rot. She turned to face Silas, her hand still resting on the wall. Clay pulls moisture out. It moves water from wet to dry, always outward, always toward the air. The surface dries. The inside dries. The wood dries. The clay breathes, Mr. Barnett. It has been breathing for longer than either of us has been alive. Then she knelt and pointed to the base of the wall where the line of river cobbles was visible beneath the first course of clay. Water falls, stone carries it away. The wood never sits in water. Silas looked at the stone footing. It was well laid, the cobbles fitted tightly angled outward to shed runoff. He hadn't noticed it on his first visit. It was a drainage system, simple but effective, the kind of detail that spoke of experience rather than improvisation. He felt a flicker of something uncomfortable in his chest, a hairline crack in the bedrock of his certainty. But the crack was not enough to change his mind. Not yet. He was a man who trusted what he had seen with his own eyes over what he was told by a woman who built bread ovens. The evidence of his experience outweighed the evidence of her confidence. He mounted his horse. He looked down at her for a long moment, his expression a mixture of frustration and genuine pity. He had tried. He had given his professional warning. The responsibility was no longer his. I hope you're right, Mrs. Harlan. For your children's sake, I hope you're right. He rode away and Margaret watched him go, her face unreadable. Then she turned back to the mixing pit, knelt in the mud, and continued working. She did not need Silas Barnett's approval. She needed the earth to be ready before the snow came. The mockery lasted for the rest of the autumn. It lived in the sidelong glances at the general store, in the conversations that stopped when Margaret walked into the room, in the way Tom Hadley grinned and shook his head every time he rode past her place. The men called her project foolish. The women were more cautious but no less skeptical. Clara Barnett, Silas's wife, told Ruth Hadley over mending that she felt sorry for the widow, that the loneliness and the grief had clearly turned her mind, that someone ought to speak to her about the children. Old Garrett Sullivan, a bachelor who lived alone in a dugout near the river and read Emerson by candlelight, was the only person in the settlement who reserved judgment. He had seen enough of the world to know that the distance between foolishness and genius was often measured only in hindsight. Margaret heard none of this, or if she heard it, she gave no sign. She worked. She dug clay and mixed it and carried it and tamped it day after day, her body moving with the tireless rhythmic efficiency of a woman who had been doing physical labor since she was old enough to carry a bucket. Lena and Peter helped carrying water and grass, their small hands learning the texture of the clay, as Margaret had learned it from Agnes, as Agnes had learned it from Ezekiel. 3 generations of knowledge passed down not in books or lectures, but in the feel of wet earth between the fingers, in the sound a well-tamped wall makes when you strike it with your palm, a deep solid thud that means the clay is packed and true. By the first week of November, the work was complete. The cabin stood transformed. The north, east, and west walls were encased in a massive earthen berm, 6 feet thick at the base, tapering to 3 feet at the eaves. The south wall stood clear its logs, and 2 small windows exposed to the low winter sun. The stone footing ringed the base like a foundation channeling water outward. The surface of the clay had been smoothed and slightly rounded, so that rain and snow melt would sheet off rather than pool. From a distance, the cabin no longer looked like a house at all. It looked like a small hill with a chimney and a door, a feature of the landscape rather than an imposition upon it. Margit stood back and looked at what she had built. 40 tons of earth, 80,000 pounds of packed clay and grass pressed against the walls of her home. She had given her house a memory. Whether that memory would be enough to hold against the cold that was coming, she could not be certain. She had done the calculations in her head, estimated the mass and the heat capacity as best she could with the rough knowledge her mother had taught her. She believed it would work, but belief was not proof. Proof would come in January when the temperature dropped and the wind descended from the mountains and the valley learned what it meant to be truly cold. On the last night before the first real snowfall, she allowed herself one moment of doubt. She stood outside in the dark, her hand pressed against the north wall of the berm, feeling its cool, solid mass beneath her palm. If she was wrong, the spring would bring rot and ruin and the contempt of every person in the valley, and she would have nowhere to go and nothing to offer her children but a pile of mud and a ruined house. She stood there until her hand went numb, and then she went inside, closed the door, and put her children to bed. The earth was either going to hold or it wasn't. She had done everything she knew how to do. The rest belonged to winter. The snow came the next morning, soft and silent, covering the dark mound of clay in a thin white veil. The valley settled into its annual stillness. Smoke rose from chimneys up and down the river. Cattle huddled against fences. The sky turned the color of old pewter and pressed down low over the mountains, heavy with the weight of what was coming. The winter arrived not as a gradual decline, but as an ambush. It began in the last week of December with a heavy snow that fell for 2 days without pause, burying the valley under a blanket of white so deep that fence posts disappeared, and the lower branches of the pines along the river bent to the ground under the weight. The snow was not the enemy. Snow was familiar, manageable, even useful as insulation for root cellars and haystacks. The enemy was what came after. On the morning of December 29th, the sky cleared. The clouds pulled apart like torn cotton and revealed a blue so deep and so cold, it looked like the inside of a steel blade. The sun rose small and distant, offering light without warmth, a lantern behind glass. And then the temperature began to fall. Not the ordinary nighttime drop that every settler expected, the gradual slide from cold to colder that could be managed with an extra log on the fire and another quilt on the bed. This was a collapse, a plummeting, as if the atmosphere itself had cracked open, and the void beyond it was pouring in. By noon, the thermometer on the porch of the general store read 12 below zero. By sunset, it read 22 below. By midnight, the mercury had retreated into the bulb and refused to come out, a small glass surrender to a cold that had exceeded the instrument's capacity to measure it. The wind arrived with the dark, not gusting, but steady, a constant razor-edge current that flowed down from the Sawatch peaks and across the valley floor with the relentless patience of a river. It found every crack, every gap, every imperfection in every structure in the settlement, and it poured through them with the precision of water finding its level. The cold snap was a high plains phenomenon. A massive dome of Arctic air had descended from the Canadian territory, sliding south along the spine of the Rockies, and settled over the Arkansas River Valley like a lid on a pot. It was not a storm. There was no blizzard, no dramatic violence. It was simply an absence, a vast patient subtraction of heat from every surface, every structure, every living thing in its path. The air itself became an adversary, each breath a sharp, painful intake that burned the nostrils and coated the inside of the lungs with a fine, cold film. The world contracted, became small, and immediate, reduced to the space between the stove and the nearest wall. For 12 consecutive days, the thermometer never rose above zero. At the Hadley place, half a mile downriver, the siege began on the first night and never relented. Tom Hadley woke before dawn on the 30th to a sound he had never heard before, a low rhythmic cracking that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. He lay in the dark, listening his breath, a white plume in the freezing air, and realized it was the logs contracting in the cold, the wood fibers shrinking as the moisture inside them crystallized. The house was groaning. He threw back the quilts and crossed to the stove in 3 quick strides, his bare feet aching against the frozen floorboards. The fire had collapsed to a thin bed of coals barely visible beneath white ash. He fed it, kindling with hands that shook, blew on the coals until they caught, then added larger splits of pine, working with the desperate efficiency of a man bailing water from a sinking boat. The fire caught grew, began to push its heat outward into the cabin. But the heat traveled no more than 6 feet before the cold consumed it. The cabin existed in 2 zones, a small island of tolerable warmth and a surrounding sea of bitter cold, and the boundary between them was as sharp and unmistakable as a wall. Ruth Hadley dressed the children in every piece of clothing they owned. She stuffed rags into the gaps around the window frames and the door. She hung their heaviest quilt over the doorway. The frost on the interior walls had grown thick and feathery overnight, climbing halfway to the ceiling in delicate white crystals that would have been beautiful if they hadn't meant that the walls were colder than the freezing point of water. The walls were not part of the house. They were part of the outside. Tom burned through a week's worth of wood in 3 days. His woodpile was shrinking at a pace that knotted his stomach. By the 4th day, he was cutting into his emergency reserve the wood he had set aside for February and March. He split it with an axe that rang like a bell in the frozen air, each stroke sending a shock up his arms that he felt in his teeth. His face was tight with worry he could not voice, because to voice it would be to admit that he was losing a war he had not known he was fighting. At the Barnett house, the situation was better by a matter of degree, but not of kind. Silas had built his own home with the care and precision he brought to every project. And the logs were tighter, the chinking more thorough, the foundation more carefully sealed. But no amount of craftsmanship could overcome the fundamental physics. The walls were lightweight, the cold was infinite, and patience always defeats a lightweight wall. Clara hung heavy quilts over every window and the door. She laid rolled blankets along the base of the walls, trying to block the currents of cold air that crept across the floor like something hunting. Their youngest son, Eli, a boy of 4, developed a cough on the 3rd night. A deep, wet, racking sound that filled the small cabin like water filling a bowl. Clara held him through the dark hours, his small body hot with fever against her chest, while the stove consumed wood with an appetite that nothing could satisfy. Silas fed the fire. His hands moved automatically, reaching for the next split of pine, opening the stove door, placing the wood on the coals, closing the door, reaching for the next split. His body performed the task, but his mind was somewhere else. It was replaying a conversation from October, hearing a woman's voice explaining something about clay and moisture, and breathing about oak frames that stayed hard as iron inside 30-year-old ovens. He pushed the memory away. The woman was wrong. Her house was certainly worse off than his. She was probably trapped in a frozen tomb of mud right now, regretting every bucket of clay she had carried. He told himself this, and he almost believed it. And then Eli coughed again, and the doubt returned, a splinter lodged beneath the skin of his certainty that would not be drawn out. Inside the Harlan cabin, a different winter was unfolding. The cold was real. Margaret could feel it in the quality of the silence outside, in the particular shade of blue. The sky turned at dusk in the way the snow creaked underfoot when she went out to fetch more wood from the small stack by the door. She was not immune, but she was living inside a different equation than her neighbors, and the difference, while quiet, was profound. The stove still needed to be fed, but not with the frantic, desperate urgency that drove Tom Hadley and Silas Barnett to exhaustion. Margaret loaded the stove before bed, a full charge of dense, slow-burning pine, and banked the coals. In any other cabin in the valley, the fire would have died by 2 in the morning, and the temperature inside would have begun its swift, inevitable collapse toward the temperature outside. But in Margaret's cabin, something else happened. The heat from the stove, rather than rushing outward through the log walls and vanishing into the night, met a mass of earth so dense and so vast that it could not pass through quickly. The 40 tons of packed clay absorbed the heat the way a lake absorbs a stone, silently, completely without disturbance. Each day's fire added its energy to the reservoir. Each night, as the air inside the cabin cooled, the clay released its stored warmth back through the logs, a slow, steady, gentle radiation that kept the interior from plunging into the bitter cold that ruled every other structure in the valley. The cabin did not stay warm the way a room with a roaring fire stays warm. There was no blast of radiant heat, no cherry-red glow from the stove at 3 in the morning. Instead, there was a pervasive ambient equilibrium, a stillness in the air that felt less like heat and more like safety. The temperature inside the Harlan cabin during the coldest nights hovered in the mid-40s, cool enough to see your breath if you exhaled hard, but warm enough to sleep without a coat, warm enough for a child to play on the floor without shivering, warm enough for life. The evidence was in the small domestic details that no thermometer could capture. The chive plant on the deep windowsill of the south-facing window, a small clay pot Margaret had brought from Missouri, remained green and upright, its thin shoots reaching toward the pale winter sun. In any other cabin, the cold radiating from the window glass would have killed it in a single night. Here, the south wall, unburned and exposed to the sun, collected what little solar energy the short winter days offered, and the mass of the earthen walls on the other 3 sides held enough warmth to keep the windowsill above freezing, even through the darkest hours. In the corner of the kitchen, far from the stove, Margaret kept a bowl of sourdough starter covered with a cloth. It was a living thing, a culture of wild yeast she had carried from Missouri in a small jar, feeding it flour and water, every few days keeping it alive the way one keeps a small flame alive. In any other cabin in the valley, it would have been a frozen dead lump, the yeast killed by temperatures well below its survival threshold. Here in the farthest corner from the fire, the starter continued its slow, quiet fermentation, bubbling with the persistence of something that has been given just enough warmth to endure. Lena and Peter played on a blanket spread on the floor, not huddled against the stove, but in the center of the room, building small structures out of kindling sticks and pine cones. Their world was the entire cabin. They moved freely, unaware that in every other home within 5 miles, children their age were wrapped in every blanket their parents owned, confined to a narrow radius of survivable warmth that ended an arm's length from the fire. Margaret watched them and allowed herself a moment of private recognition. Not pride exactly, something quieter. The confirmation that what she had known in her hands and her bones had proven true in the world. The clay remembered. The earth held. On the 6th day of the cold snap, Ruth Hadley arrived at her door just after midday, carrying her youngest child in her arms. The boy Samuel was 2 years old. He was wrapped in so many layers of clothing and blankets that he looked like a bundle of rags with a small flushed face peering out from the center. His breathing was rapid and shallow, a thin whistle on each exhale that Margaret recognized as the sound of lungs fighting congestion. His skin was the color of candle wax. His eyes were glassy and unfocused. Ruth herself looked hollowed out, her face raw from the wind. Her lips cracked, her eyes carrying the weight of days spent watching a child suffer without the power to help. She stood on Margaret's doorstep holding her son, and for a moment she couldn't speak. The cold hung on her clothing and her hair like something alive, unwilling to release its grip. Margaret took Ruth's arm and pulled her inside. She closed the door. Ruth took 2 steps into the cabin and stopped. The change registered in her body before her mind could name it. The muscles in her shoulders and jaw, clenched for 6 days against the cold, began to unlock. She looked around the cabin with the bewildered expression of a woman who has walked through a door and arrived in a different season. The stove was burning but gently. The walls were dry, no frost, no crystalline patterns climbing toward the ceiling. The floorboards were cool but bearable. In the corner, a green plant on a windowsill. On the table, a bowl of something under a cloth, and when Ruth leaned close, she could see it moving, barely a slow-living fermentation that should have been impossible. The tears came without warning. They slid down Ruth's chapped cheeks and fell onto the blankets around her son. She did not wipe them away. She simply stood in the quiet air of Margaret Harlan's cabin and let something inside her break open. Margaret took the child. She unwrapped the outermost blankets, felt the fever burning beneath his cold, tightened skin. She carried him not to the stove, but to the east wall, where the log surface, backed by 4 feet of packed clay, gave off a gentle, even warmth, unlike the searing, drying blast of a fire. She laid the boy on a pallet of folded quilts against the wall, tucked a blanket around him, and spooned warm broth into his mouth, a few drops at a time, until the whistle in his breathing began to ease and his eyes lost their vacant stare. Samuel Hadley fell asleep against the warm wall of Margaret Harlan's cabin, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was for the first time in days deep and regular. Ruth sat beside him on the floor, her back against the logs, feeling the warmth of the clay through the wood seeping into her spine, and she closed her eyes. Margaret brought her coffee. She did not explain. She did not lecture. She sat across from Ruth and waited, because waiting was something she had always understood, and because the cabin was warm enough for patience. Ruth would carry this story back to the settlement. She would tell it to every woman she knew, and each time she would describe the same thing. Not the temperature, not the engineering, the feeling of walking through that door. And the women who heard it would remember. But the men required a different language of proof. They needed to touch it with their own hands. That proof arrived 2 days later, on the 8th morning of the cold snap, delivered not by argument or testimony, but by a runaway mule. Silas Barnett woke to the sound of his lean-to gate banging in the wind, and knew before he opened his eyes that Jude was gone. The mule, a gray, wall-eyed creature of legendary stubbornness, had been testing the latch of his enclosure for weeks, and the cold had finally made the wood brittle enough for him to force it. Silas considered leaving the animal to its fate. But Jude was worth $40, and $40 was a month's income, and a man who let a $40 mule freeze to death because he didn't want to get out of bed was a man who had surrendered to the cold. Silas had not surrendered. Not yet. He pulled on every layer he owned, wrapped a wool scarf around his face until only his eyes showed, and stepped outside into a world remade. Every surface was coated in hoarfrost, the moisture from the air itself frozen into elaborate feathered structures that turned fence posts into white pillars and tree branches into chandeliers of ice. The air had substance, a faint, glittering haze of suspended ice crystals that caught the low sun and shattered it into fragments. Each breath was a negotiation between his lungs and the frozen atmosphere. He followed Jude's tracks south along the river. He passed the Hadley place. It was glazed in a shimmering coat of ice, the logs and roof white, where interior moisture had migrated outward and frozen on the surface. A thick column of smoke punched upward from the chimney, dense and frantic. Silas looked at it and felt a grim solidarity. They were all losing at the same rate. The tracks led him up a small rise. He climbed it slowly, his boots breaking through the crust with each step, his thighs burning. At the top, he stopped. Below him, nestled in a shallow depression, was the Harlan place. And something was wrong with the picture. In a world that was uniformly white and glittering, the low rounded form of the cabin was a patch of dark matte brown. The earthen berm was not white. It was not frosted. It was not glazed with ice. It sat in the frozen landscape like a warm stone dropped in snow, visually impossible, a violation of every rule that governed the behavior of materials at 20 below zero. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, not a column, not a desperate plume, a curl, lazy, unhurried, the smoke of a fire that was doing its work without strain. Silas stood on the ridge and stared. His carpenter's mind, trained to understand materials under stress, fought to reconcile what he was seeing. Everything in the valley was frozen. Everything was bleeding heat into the sky. But the mud hill was dark. Its surface was above freezing. The heat was staying inside. The earth was holding it. He descended the slope and walked up to the north wall, the face that had taken the full force of the Arctic wind for 8 days. He pulled off his thick mitten. His bare hand stung. He hesitated, bracing for the shock of contact with something that should have been as cold as the frozen world around it. He pressed his palm flat against the clay. The shock came, but it was the wrong kind. There was no biting cold, no burning numbness. What he felt was so fundamentally at odds with everything he knew about materials in extreme cold that his hand stayed pressed against the wall while his mind scrambled for a framework. The earth was not warm, but it was profoundly resonantly not cold in a world where everything else was bitter and unyielding. It felt like pressing your hand against the flank of a sleeping animal, something with its own internal warmth, something that existed in a separate thermal reality from the frozen landscape surrounding it. He could feel a deep latent energy stored within the mass, a vast reservoir of warmth releasing itself so slowly that the surface remained above freezing, even in the deadliest cold the valley had ever known. He stood with his hand on the wall. The cold around him ceased to matter. He was touching the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. Everything his house was hemorrhaging into the sky was stored right here in this massive, derided, brilliant wall of packed earth. His house was a sieve. This house was a vault. A sound broke the trance. A heavy, wet snort followed by the grinding of large teeth on frozen grass. Silas turned his head. 10 feet away, pressed tight against the east wall of the cabin, stood Jude. The mule had found the warmest surface in the valley, by pure animal instinct navigating half a mile of frozen terrain in the dark to stand against a wall that radiated enough heat to keep his hide from freezing. The animal regarded Silas with the placid, faintly superior expression of a creature that has solved a problem its owner has not yet recognized. Silas looked at the mule. He looked at the wall. He felt the ghost of warmth still tingling in his bare palm. And he laughed. It was a short, rough, involuntary sound, the laugh of a man whose certainty has just been shattered by a mule, and it was the first time he had laughed in 8 days. He caught Jude's halter and led him away from the wall, but he did not turn toward his own cabin. He walked around to the south-facing door and knocked. Margit opened the door. She looked at Silas Barnett standing in the snow with his mule, his face raw, one mitten, missing his eyes, carrying an expression she had never seen on him before. It was not contrition, not apology. It was the look of a man who has just discovered the boundary of his own knowledge and who has decided in that moment that crossing it matters more than defending it. One word, that was all he brought to her door. Not an argument, not a qualification. Just the word offered like an open hand, how. Margit stepped aside and let him in. Jude, displaying the practical intelligence that had brought him to the warm wall in the first place, shouldered his way to the lee side of the berm and stood content. Silas crossed the threshold and the air changed around him. He had been braced for the damp chill of a clay tomb for confirmation that his predictions had been right. What met him instead was a warmth that had no visible source. Not the fierce localized blast of a stove at full roar. Something that seemed to emanate from the structure itself, from the walls and the floor and the spaces between, a warmth that was everywhere and nowhere uniform and calm like the interior of an oven. Hours after the fire has been swept out. Lena and Peter were sitting on the floor near the table eating cornmeal porridge from tin bowls. They were not wearing coats. They were not wrapped in blankets. They were simply eating with the unself-conscious ease of children who do not know they are supposed to be suffering. Silas looked at the walls, dry. He looked at the floor, cool but bearable. He looked at the stove, burning low, a bed of coals glowing behind the damper, consuming fuel at a rate that would have lasted his own stove perhaps 2 hours. In Margit's cabin, this modest fire was sufficient. The earth was supplying the rest. Margit stood by the table watching him absorb it. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of his mud coffin. She waited because she understood that what was happening inside Silas Barnett's mind was more important than anything she could say, and that the surest way to ruin a man's learning is to interrupt it with teaching. When he was ready, he turned to her. His voice had lost its professional authority. In its place was something unguarded, the raw tone of genuine discovery. You didn't build a wall. You built a hearth around your house. Margaret held up her hands and mimed the shape of her mother's bread oven that domed the thick walls, the cavity where the fire burned. Then she turned her hands outward, reversing the geometry, the fire inside, the clay outside. The same principle inverted, an oven turned inside out. Silas understood. He understood with the immediate physical comprehension of a man who works with materials every day of his life. He had spent 20 years perfecting resistance tightening joints, sealing gaps, building walls that block the wind. But blocking the wind was only half the equation. The other half was holding the heat, giving it mass to saturate a body so dense that it could absorb a day's fire and release it over the course of a night. He had been building armor. Margaret had built a battery. He sat down at her table. Margaret poured him coffee. And for the next hour, in the warm, still air of the cabin, the valley called a Folly. The best carpenter in the Arkansas River Valley listened while a woman who built bread ovens explained the physics of heat. The cold broke on the 11th day, not with a dramatic thaw, but with a slow, grudging retreat. The temperature climbed to 5 above zero on the morning of January 9th, and the valley exhaled. Smoke still rose from every chimney, but the plumes were thinner, less frantic. Icicles formed on south-facing eaves, the first liquid water anyone had seen in nearly 2 weeks. The world was still frozen, but the siege was over. The accounting began immediately. Each family tallied its losses with the grim arithmetic of survival. Tom Hadley had burned through his entire winter wood supply and most of his emergency reserve. He had chopped and burned 14 fence posts, each one a day's labor from the previous spring. Each one infrastructure that would need rebuilding before the cattle could be turned out in May. Ruth Hadley appeared at the general store for the first time after the cold snap, carrying Samuel on her hip, with the fierce grip of a woman who had measured the exact distance between her child and catastrophe. Samuel was alive. His cough had subsided, but the boy was thin and pale, and Ruth's face told a story that went deeper than any words she offered. The Barnett household had fared better, but narrowly. Silas had rationed his wood more carefully than most, but he had still consumed 2/3 of his winter supply in 12 days. Eli's cough had deepened into something that required Clara to sleep sitting upright, holding the boy against her chest for 5 consecutive nights. The hollows under Clara's eyes told that part of the story. Silas himself moved through the days after the cold snap, with a distracted inward quality that Clara noticed but did not question. She had been married to him long enough to know that when Silas went quiet, something was being constructed in his mind, and the construction could not be hurried. Across the settlement, the stories accumulated like snowdrift. The Mercer family, in their half-finished cabin on the upper bench, had abandoned their home on the 5th night and walked 2 miles through darkness to shelter with neighbors arriving with frostbitten fingers and a baby wrapped in every scrap of cloth they owned. Garrett Sullivan, the bachelor in the dugout, had survived by burning his only chair, his table, and the shelves he had built to hold his books. He sat in the general store on the day after the break, drinking whiskey from a tin cup, and announced that he had kept warm by reading Emerson by firelight and then feeding Emerson to the fire, and that the Transcendentalist burned about as well as he wrote, which was to say, unevenly. Amidst these tales of hardship and dark humor, the story of the Harlan cabin began to circulate. It moved through the settlement along 2 channels carried by 2 different kinds of authority, and the fact that both converged on the same conclusion gave the story a weight that neither could have carried alone. Ruth Hadley was the first channel. She told her story to every woman she encountered, and she told it the same way each time, not with embellishment, but with the flat recall of a witness. She described the walk through the snow with Samuel in her arms. She described stepping through Margaret's door. She described the stillness, the warmth that came from the walls, and not just the stove. She described her son sleeping against the east wall, not against the stove, against the wall, and the wall being warm enough to ease his breathing. She described the green chives on the windowsill. She described the sourdough starter alive and fermenting in the coldest corner of the kitchen. The women who heard Ruth's story listened with the sharp attentiveness of people who have spent 12 days watching their children shiver and who have no patience for theory. They wanted to know one thing: did it work? Ruth's answer was a child sleeping peacefully against a warm wall. That was sufficient. Silas Barnett was the second channel. His conversion carried a different gravity, the weight of expertise publicly reversed. When Silas stood up in the general store on a Saturday afternoon and told the assembled men of the settlement that the widow Harlan had been right and he had been wrong, the silence that followed was absolute. He did not dramatize. He did not grovel. He laid out the facts the way he would lay out a building plan, with precision and without sentiment. He described what he had seen from the ridge. He described pressing his hand against the north wall. He described what he had felt. He described walking inside the cabin and standing in air that was warm not because of a raging fire, but because of something stored in the earth itself. Tom Hadley, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee, set the cup down. The grin he wore whenever the mud hill came up was gone. In its place was the expression of a man performing rapid arithmetic, calculating the difference between 14 burnt fence posts and Margit Harlan's modest, unhurried woodpile. Silas finished by saying something that would be repeated in the valley for years, long after the specific details of the cold snap had faded. His voice was steady, without self-pity, the voice of a man stating a fact that had cost him something to learn. I have been building houses for 20 years and I have been solving half the problem. I kept the wind out, she kept the heat in. Those are not the same thing, and I should have known the difference. The room was quiet. Then Garrett Sullivan raised his tin cup. To the mud hill, he offered and drank. The laughter that followed was not unkind. It was the laughter of recognition of men who understood that the joke had been on all of them and that the punchline had been delivered by a woman with a shovel and a wheelbarrow. The spring came slowly, as it always does above 7,000 feet. The snow retreated up the mountains in stages, leaving behind a valley that was muddy, raw, and scarred with the evidence of hard survival. Broken fences, depleted haystacks, gaunt cattle nosing at the first green shoots along the river. Silas Barnett was the first to ask for Margit's help. He rode to her cabin on a morning in late April, the ground still soft with snowmelt, and found her in her garden turning the soil with a spade. Lena was planting peas beside her, pressing each seed into the earth with a steady thumb. Peter was hauling water from the creek, his bucket only half full because his arms were still too short for the weight, but his face set with the resolve of a boy who has decided that this is his job and he will do it regardless. Silas dismounted and stood for a moment, his hat in his hands, turning it slowly in his fingers. The confidence was still in his shoulders and his stance, but it was alloyed now with something quieter. He had come not to advise but to learn, and the unfamiliarity of that position showed in the way he worked up to the question. Mrs. Harlan, I would like to burn my house and I would like your help doing it. Margit straightened, pushed a strand of hair from her face and studied him. She searched for condescension, for the residual pride of a man who wants help but cannot admit it on equal terms. She found neither. What she found was a carpenter standing in front of a kiln builder, asking to be taught and meaning it. I will need your drainage design, she answered. And the simplicity of the statement, its assumption of collaboration rather than instruction, told Silas everything he needed to know about the terms. They began in May as soon as the ground softened enough to dig. The project was different from Margit's original berm, not a solitary act of desperate innovation, but a deliberate marriage of two different bodies of knowledge. Silas contributed what he knew best. He designed a stone footing that improved on Margit's, a double course of flat river stones laid on a gravel bed angled at a precise 5-degree slope that channeled water away from the walls with the efficiency of a culvert. He built a wooden cap at the berm line to prevent rain from sheeting down the clay face. He reinforced the cabin corners where the weight of earth pressed hardest, adding braces that distributed the load along the wall. Margaret contributed what she knew. She selected the clay, testing it from 3 deposits before choosing a vein of dense, iron-rich alluvial clay from a cut bank upstream. She mixed it with a higher proportion of chopped grass than she had used on her own cabin, explaining to Silas that the fibers, as they decomposed within the clay, would create a network of microscopic air channels that improved insulative value without reducing density enough to compromise heat storage. She applied the clay in her careful horizontal courses, stamping each one until it rang with the deep solid note that meant the earth was true. The result was something neither could have built alone. The drainage was better. The load distribution was better. The surface was smoother, more resistant to erosion. But the thermal performance was identical because thermal performance depended not on craftsmanship, but on physics, on the sheer mass of clay pressed against the walls. And mass was something Margaret had understood from the beginning. By the end of June, the Barnett cabin looked like a twin of the Harlan place, a low mound of earth with a chimney, a door, and south-facing windows. Silas stood back and examined it with the critical eye of a man who has just completed a project. He was not embarrassed by the transformation. He was not mourning the clean, angular lines he had spent his career perfecting. He felt something unexpected. The cabin was not beautiful by any standard he had previously held, but it was right. It was a structure that acknowledged the forces acting upon it and responded with intelligence rather than stubbornness. It was the first house he had ever built that felt truly finished. Tom Hadley was the second to convert, driven less by intellectual curiosity than by the memory of 14 burned fence posts and a wife who still flinched when the wind picked up. He arrived at the Harlan cabin in early July, hat in hand. He looked at the ground for a moment, then looked up. "I burned my fences to keep my family warm last winter. I can dig some mud to make sure I never have to do that again." He started the next morning. By autumn of 1882, 3 more families had adopted the method. The name evolved as the practice spread. Nobody called it Harlan's Folly anymore. For a while it was the Harlan method. Then as Silas began promoting it with his professional reputation and Carpenter's vocabulary, it became simply earthbanking. The term had the plain functional sound that frontier people preferred, a name that described exactly what it was without pretension or mystery. The most effective agent of the idea's spread, however, was neither Margaret nor Silas. It was a freight driver named Deke Rawlins, a lean, weathered man who hauled coal and supplies along the Arkansas River between Canyon City and Leadville. Deke was not a philosopher or a scientist. He was a businessman who kept meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger, and his understanding of the world was organized around quantities hauled and prices charged. He knew to the pound how much coal each household on his route consumed. He knew to the cord how much wood they burned. He knew who paid on time and who didn't, who was prospering and who was going under. In the winter of 1882, Deke noticed an anomaly in his numbers. The Harlan household had consumed less than 2 cords of wood and a quarter ton of coal for the entire season. The Hadley household, in a cabin of comparable size, had consumed 5.5 cords and 3/4 of a ton. The Barnett household, newly burned, had dropped from 6 cords to just under 3. The numbers were unambiguous and far more persuasive than any talk of thermal mass. A family that burned 2 cords instead of 6 saved $12 a winter. Over 10 years, that was $120 enough for a good horse, a new wagon, or a year's provisions. Deke told his fellow drivers. He showed them the ledger. The drivers told their customers along routes north and south. The idea, proven not in the language of science but in the language of money, began to spread with the quiet persistence of a useful truth finding its audience. A driver named McClellan burned his homestead near Salida. A rancher outside Buena Vista hired Silas to burn his main house and bunkhouse. A mining engineer in Leadville heard the story from a coal hauler, investigated, and wrote a letter to a colleague in Denver, describing the technique in terms that would have been at home in an engineering journal. By 1885, dozens of homes and outbuildings in the upper Arkansas River Valley bore the distinctive profile of earth banking the low-rounded berms, replacing the sharp corners and exposed log walls of traditional construction. The technique was not universal. Many families resisted it, preferring the familiar geometry of the cabin, mistrusting the appearance of a house that looked like something a badger would build. But those who adopted it never went back. The economics were too clear. The comfort was too real. The difference between a bermed cabin and an unbermed one on a night when the temperature dropped to 20 below was the difference between living and merely surviving. Margit Harlan did not seek credit for any of this. She did not lecture. She did not write articles or give demonstrations. She continued to live in her cabin with her 2 children, tending her garden in summer, feeding her stove in winter, maintaining her berm with the same patient attention she brought to everything she built. When neighbors came for help, she helped. When they didn't, she did not seek them out. Her authority grew not through self-promotion, but through results, the quiet accumulation of evidence that is the most durable form of reputation. Silas Barnett became the method's evangelist. He incorporated earth banking into his standard building practice, offering it to every client, recommending it to most. He developed refinements better. Drainage improved surface treatments methods for integrating the berm with the roof line. He gave Margit full credit in every conversation, a generosity that cost him nothing. And earned a great deal, because a man who admits he learned from an unlikely source is a man whose future recommendations carry the weight of honesty rather than habit. The partnership between them remained professional and cordial, grounded in mutual respect and a shared understanding that their 2 bodies of knowledge, wood and earth resistance and storage, were not rivals but complements. They never became friends in the conventional sense. Silas was expansive and social. Margit was reserved and self-contained. But they were colleagues, and in a frontier community where expertise was scarce and collaboration scarcer, that was something worth preserving. The principle Margit Harlan applied to her log cabin in 1881 sits today at the center of modern sustainable building science. Her earthen berm was a crude but effective application of the concepts that now define high-performance construction: passive solar design, super insulation, and above all thermal mass, the deliberate use of dense, heavy materials in a building's envelope to store and regulate heat. Modern earth-sheltered homes bury portions of their structure underground to exploit the stable temperature of the surrounding soil, drastically reducing energy loads. Phase-change drywall concrete thermal floors, water wall systems. All of these are engineered descendants of the same principle Margit learned from her mother's bread oven in Missouri. What she accomplished with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, architects now model with computational fluid dynamics, software, and finite element analysis. The tools have changed. The physics has not changed at all. She demonstrated that a building's performance is determined not by the tightness of its skin alone, but by the depth of its core. She proved that true efficiency emerges from working with the natural rhythms of heating and cooling, not from brute opposition. Her mud hill, dismissed by every practical man in the valley, was a century ahead of its time. There is a truth in the story of the Harlan cabin that extends beyond heat transfer and fuel economics. It is a truth about what we choose to value and what we choose to dismiss, about the difference between knowledge that comes from tradition and knowledge that comes from credentials, about the cost of certainty and the reward of humility. The valley learned in that hard winter a lesson Margit Harlan had carried in her hands since childhood. What you pack around a house holds what you would otherwise lose. On the frontier, life was a constant exercise in conservation: food, seed, energy, hope. A conventional cabin was a spendthrift throwing its heat into the wind each night, living fire to fire, load to load. Margit built a house that saved. The earthen walls she packed around her home became a repository not just for thermal energy, but for security, for rest, for the small comforts that make the difference between a shelter and a home. That stored warmth meant a child sleeping through the night without coughing, a bowl of porridge that stayed warm on the table, a family's world larger than the desperate circle around a glowing stove. By packing the earth, the whole valley considered worthless around her home, she held on to the things within it that were beyond price. Strength is not always in the hardness of the wall. Sometimes it lives in the wall's capacity to absorb, to hold, and to give back. The earth she piled against her cabin was not a defense against the cold. It was an embrace of the warmth, a way of ensuring that what was precious would not be surrendered to the indifferent sky. Clay does not argue. It does not explain itself. It does not ask for credit or seek applause. It simply holds what is given to it patiently, faithfully, for as long as it is needed. In this, it was very much like the woman who shaped it.